Welcome, class, to this Academy of Citizen Activism, this immersive teaching experience. So today we're going to do something, I believe, truly extraordinary. We will have the opportunity to learn together, to learn the principles of advocacy using a case study. Now, this class is based on a set of assumptions. The first of which is we assume a collective brilliance. That is to say, every member of this class contributes to the collective brilliance of the class. That is to say, the sum of the parts is much greater than any of the parts. So there's a collective brilliance, if you will. Number two, we assume that this is a morally immersive experience. That is to say that you will immerse yourselves in this case study, in this public policy, legal, social justice conversation. By immersing yourself, we assume that you are a moral participant, a social justice participant, not an analytic spectator. That is to say, we assume that everyone in this class cares about the pursuit of justice, cares about the people on whose behalf you claim to advocate. That's critically important because by morally immersing yourself in the facts, in the discussion, it leads to clearer, sharper thinking with respect to advocacy. Thirdly, we will take note of the fact that we're going to use the case study method, and that all of you are well qualified to engage in the case study method. What do we mean by that? At a law school, they study legal cases. In a business school, they study cases as well. Cases of business failure, business success. In the Kennedy School, as a school of government, we have case studies of public policy, case studies of social justice. And by case study, we simply mean a story that contains a set of facts, a collection of people, a set of circumstances that we study, that we pick apart, we delve into as a way of extracting the legal lessons, the public policy lessons, the moral lessons, the social justice lessons, the social justice principles of advocacy that equip and empower us to be effective in what we do in terms of pursuing justice. So we use this case study method. In this collective endeavor, this is not the province, not the monopoly of a professor. This is, in fact, the shared responsibility of every participant in this experience, every member of this class. And by class, we mean a smaller class and a larger class. The smaller class includes those 15, 20 or so people you see on the screen who raise their hands in order to participate in the discussion. But beyond the smaller class, we have a larger class, which includes all of you across the country and literally around the world who are able to use the chat function, the chat feature, to put forward a question, put forward an insight, to lift up a comment so that you might contribute to this collective educational experience. Now, in this effort, we are assisted by those in the small classroom, those in the larger classroom, but we're also assisted by an extraordinary teaching team, including our faculty assistant, Kathleen Schneid, several course assistants, including Courtney Brunson, Dwight Nell, Anand Hafez, and of course, my colleague in so much of the social justice work, the Reverend Stephen A. Green, who will join us in the discussion after we introduce this case. We summarize this case with a few slides. So class, before you are two pictures, two portraits, if you will, of iconic figures of the American civil rights movement. That is to say, the civil rights movement before the civil rights movement that we're currently in. On my right is arrestee 7089. And to my left is arrestee 7053. Arrestee 7089, the man in the mugshot 7089, is of course the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Arrestee 7053, mugshot 7053, is of course Mrs. Rosa Louise Parks, the mother of the modern civil rights movement. These photographs, these sepia tone pictures of yesteryear, these black and white pictures of the past, are in fact a portrait, if you will, of the degree to which America has literally criminally recognized its citizenry. That is to say, we have 70+ million criminal records, or Americans with criminal records, at least at the point of this case study. That is to say, people who have been convicted, people who have been arrested, people who have been ensnared in the digital record keeping of the carceral state. So these pictures literally represent for us the length, the breadth, the extent of criminal records. Why? Because these criminal records were literally discovered after decades, buried in the bottom of a file cabinet in Alabama. And so the records of the past are certainly among the records of the present, which of course speak to the criminal justice challenge before this class today. And by way of reminder, this class is of course entitled Prisons, Jails, and Jobs, a Case Study in Redemption and Justice. So with that said, Kathleen, if you can turn to the next slide. In this picture class, we have in this season of commencements and graduations, we have a picture of graduates of the Harvard Kennedy School where I teach. These graduates are like graduates at Fisk, Howard, the University of California, Santa Cruz, the University of South Carolina, Duke, North Carolina A&T. These graduates are like graduates of high schools, colleges, and universities everywhere. These graduates are filled with a sense of pride, filled with a sense of accomplishment. They are arrayed, attired, adorned, if you will, in caps and gowns, literally either holding or reaching for pieces of parchment, which are a testament to what they have accomplished. They are surrounded by family and friends who are literally overjoyed with their accomplishment. So this picture is emotionally identical to pictures, graduation pictures in our phones and old-fashioned photo albums that we have seen and that we currently see and will yet see in the weeks and days to come. Kathleen, let's go to that next slide. Class, I ask that you take a close look at this picture. In this picture, another graduation picture, you see people who are also adorned in blue robes, wearing caps and gowns, who have or are yet reaching for pieces of parchment, degrees, diplomas, certifications. The people in this second picture are not graduates of the Kennedy School, not graduates of Fisk, not graduates of Howard, not graduates of Jackson State University. These students are graduates of a workforce development program. And in this workforce development program, they have literally accomplished so much in so short a period of time. These pictures, the first picture and the second picture, are emotionally identical and yet demographically quite distinct. The graduates of the Kennedy School or the graduates of a college, a university, or a high school, those graduates often have longer educational backgrounds and records and pedigrees, as opposed to the graduates of a workforce development program where many of them have gone into such a program, not having graduated from a distinguished elementary school or high school, but literally having emerged from the bowels of the carceral state. right? So we have these graduates of this workforce development program who've entered this program coming out of jails, coming out of prisons, coming out of very difficult circumstances, entering into this program, and they are very similar, but in some ways very different from the graduates of many colleges and universities. How so? The graduates of this workforce development program have a numeracy level or literacy level at the middle school level. That is to say, at a 6th or 7th grade level. The graduates of the Kennedy School and high schools and colleges, universities across the state, often benefit from having had many educational opportunities. Now, we lift these pictures before you to allow you, enable you to morally immerse yourselves in the facts and the circumstances of the case that we are about to describe. So, contemplating these two pictures, I want to take you back to the case study that you received in your reading material. You recall, of course, that a case study is simply a story. It's a story containing facts, sometimes law, sometimes policy, in many instances, certainly in this instance, social justice. In the case study that many of you received, that I'll recap for you, I'll summarize for you, you encounter an organization called the Institute for Social Justice. The Institute for Social Justice was a social justice think and do tank, a think tank that also did engage in direct services, a think tank in which half the employees were lawyers and policy analysts responsible for drafting legislation, responsible for crafting laws, responsible for describing best practices, engaging in regulatory reform, pressing the case for social justice in terms of law and policy. But the other half of the Institute for Social Justice were case managers and social workers. The case managers and social workers, as well as the public policy analysts and lawyers, collectively worked on social justice problems facing people with criminal records. That is to say, people who've emerged from the bowels of the carceral state with a record of their past impacting adversely their present and future. Now, class, this case study is not something that we're asking you to merely read. This is a case study in which we're asking you to literally immerse yourselves as a character, as a figure. So this Institute for Social Justice, a social justice think and do tank, situated in a city where a great many people have criminal records. Many people who are Black and brown, Latino and African American and continental African, people from various races and ethnicities, but disproportionately Black and brown. The Institute for Social Justice ran this workforce development program where there were commencements, where there were graduations. Now, I want you to imagine that if you were the policy director, the person responsible for legislation, the person responsible for drafting laws, the person responsible for putting forward a social justice change and transformation agenda in the courts, in the legislatures to make a difference in people's lives. I want you to imagine you're the person who's responsible for that agenda. Now you're at the graduation. You're watching the people you've mentored, the people you've supported, the people whose lives you've invested in walk across the stage in a cap, in a gown, receive a piece of parchment that essentially says you are prepared to compete, to apply, to interview for work. Now imagine those graduates entered the labor market having been told by you, having paid your debt to society, having interviewed, having learned how to tie a tie, having learned how to wear a dress and conduct yourself on an interview. Now you're going to be able to be gainfully employed. Now imagine those same graduates come back to you and say, we have encountered a box that is not as tall as a skyscraper, but it might as well be. And this box, a millimeter high and a millimeter wide, which is positioned on an employment application, is innocuously written but apprehensively answered. That is to say, plainly written but fearfully answered. This box poses this question: have you ever been arrested or convicted of a crime? Your graduates come back to you and say, we encountered this box. We checked the box affirmatively. We checked the box truthfully. And as a consequence, our physical application, employment application, was thrown into the circular file, the trash can. It was thrown into the digital file, i.e. the digital trash can. In other words, we didn't get a chance to compete for the job. We didn't get a chance to be considered for the job. We didn't get a chance to demonstrate what we could do. Your graduates come back to you with these stories. You, as the policy director, know that what they have experientially attested to is empirically true. Why? Because you've studied the scholarship of a woman and a scholar, the late scholar, Deva Padgett, who taught at the Harvard Kennedy School, and she wrote a book called Mark. And in her book, what she discovered was that people with criminal records face a certain bias in the labor market. What she discovered, what she described in her book called Marked, was that once you check the box, your chances of receiving a callback, receiving an interview, precipitously decline. And not only that, that if you're Black, your chances of getting a callback, a follow-up, an interview decline much further, much deeper, much to your detriment, much to your discouragement. Right? And so what your clients are telling you is a matter of story, you know, as a matter of statistics. And you understand that not only the clients facing discrimination in terms of not being considered for jobs, you understand it as a matter of law that there's certain jobs for which many people are ineligible to be considered at all. That is to say, collateral sanctions. So now I need you to imagine, class, you're a policy director. You've got a degree from the Kennedy School or some such place, master's in public policy, master's in public administration. And the people come to you and they say to you, we did what you told us to do. We interviewed, we did all the right things, we paid our debt to society, and yet we've encountered this box, we've encountered this employment discrimination, and we find it difficult and sometimes impossible to be considered for a job. And the people ask, what are you going to do? How are you going to respond? This question cannot be ducked. It cannot be evaded. It cannot be sidestepped. This is a question that you are being asked professionally that affects you personally. So in terms of this case study, we're asking you as morally immersed participants in this case study and in this class, what are you going to do? And related to the question of what are you going to do about the box is this first question, which helps us appreciate the scope of the problem. And the question is quite simply this, and this is the question that we begin our discussion with, which is who's affected by the criminal background box? Who's impacted by the criminal background box? Now this is not a rhetorical question. This is a real question, right? I think Catherine has raised her emoji hand. I'm gonna ask the rest of y'all to raise your real hands because people need to see that y'all are alive and well and not just pixelated images on the screen. So Kathleen, you raise your hand. Who would you? Who's impacted by it?
Well, I would start off by saying the 70 and actually up to 100 million people that have arrest or conviction records. And just to continue with this analogy that you did with these two graduations, there are now as many people in the labor market with criminal records as there are with college degrees. This is about a third of Americans, just to like add to this sense of scope. I would say that they are definitely affected, and then I'll add one more and would love to hear others' thoughts, but also employers are affected when they immediately discard people from, because of this box, they lose out on really qualified candidates with experience. So I'll pause there.
I'm going to ask the Reverend Stephen A. Green to lift up that second question.
Yeah, thank you. And such a robust conversation happening so far. When we talk about the impact of this box, this proverbial box that encloses opportunities and locks folks out of new ways to engage in society. Who are the faces of reform or transformation? Do we have perfect or imperfect victims that can illuminate the impact that this box has had on people's opportunities and access? Who are the most affected or the most sympathetic? Is it a Claudette Colvin or Rosa Parks?
We're going to get to that. Salam has just alerted me that we have someone in the larger class who wants to weigh in on this. So let me come back to you, Reverend Green.
Yes, Kimberly Short wanted to answer back to your question in terms of who's impacted. So she says the community, if that returning citizen can't find employment, everyone around this graduate is impacted. You can't provide for yourself and family, and the community ultimately pays for this. She's really highlighting this ripple effect.
But Kimberly, we might go even farther. What about the emotional cost? Anybody in the chat thinking about that? Like, is there any impact in terms of the cohesiveness of families when you have a person, a mother, a father, a parent who's unable to take care of their children? Talk to me. So that as that question is an answer is percolating, right? In this class, this is a highly caffeinated discussion. So we're going to allow the analysis to percolate a little while. So Reverend Green is asked the question, so who are the faces of reform? In other words, if you decide to do something, to engage in some kind of reform, some kind of transformation, who represents your movement? Who are the faces? Now, this class, we have unusually good-looking people in the small classroom, unusually good-looking people in the larger classroom. But who are the faces? Who are the representatives? Who are the symbols? Those in the small classroom.
I believe Gina has her hand up.
Gina.
Hi, Professor Brooks, and hi, Reverend Green. So I think it's really important to show the humanity of the people that are actually affected by the issues with that we're discussing about the ban the box and all of that, the checking the box, I should say. So I immediately thought of two potential faces that could be representing of those formerly incarcerated people. One is a young Black or brown man that showed a lot of promise, maybe was already accepted into college, has a lot of academic promise, a lot of community standing, etc., but had a minor offense and got derailed. And because of that, now faces an uncertain future in terms of education, employment, etc. So I think that would be one person. Another that I was thinking that was very close to my heart is potentially a young or not so young mother, Black or brown mother with children that maybe got caught up into the whole system because of she was an accessory to something, maybe a partner, and wasn't directly directly, but got caught up in the whole system, and again has a lot of responsibilities that go beyond herself. As we were speaking to the importance of that this doesn't affect not only the individual but the family and the community and all of that. So those are some thoughts.
So Gina, that was a very thoughtful response to this question of who are the symbols, the faces of reform or transformation? You lifted up two, the first of which would be using a young African-American or Latinx man guilty of a minor offense as likely invoking empathy or sympathy. Your second example in terms of using a woman who is guilty of being an accessory to a crime, not unlike Kimba Smith, who was pardoned by President Clinton, who was a graduate of Hampton University, guilty of being an accessory to a drug crime, first offense, but who received a draconian and excessively long sentence. Good examples, excellent examples. But the question I have for you, question I have for Anon is, what about violent offenders? How do we invoke sympathy, empathy, a sense of humanity for them?
Thank you, Professor Brooks, for allowing me to join you, and thank you, Reverend Green. That's a counterpoint that I actually wanted to highlight. Now, I think Gina's brought up some very sympathetic stories, people caught up in minor offenses, people who might be an accessory to a crime. But we also, I think, of who is good enough to be employed or re-enter the system or deserves a to be gainfully employed. And I was thinking about violent offenders, and because if we don't include violent offenders in our vision of justice, well then, just as Bjorn highlighted, we allow them to recidivate, we allow them to re-enter the system, we allow them to be the ones who we fail the most. And so perhaps we don't just highlight the stories that are easy to sympathize with, but people who might make some people uncomfortable, and explain how they deserve justice just as much as anybody else.
So I want to.
Yeah, please. And then Salam, we're coming to you in the chat. If you can just make sure you lift up our colleague and classmate in terms of their name. So Reverend Green.
Sure. How do we frame? What is the framing of a campaign that would allow that room to lift up someone who has been disproportionately affected because of the violent crime or things like that? So how do you narrativize that or frame that to build a coalition around it?
Okay, excellent. So put a pin in that, because
we'll go back
Reverend
to
Reverend Green is linking the what to the empathetic what to the empathetic who. In other words, who is the face of the movement, but by what means do we convey their identity and humanity, right? We've seen across this conference, not just the policy wonks, not just the lawyers, I'm one, God forgive me, but we've seen poets, we've seen artists, we have comedians, people from the news media who are thinking about images and messages. So, Salam, somebody from the big classroom.
Yes. So we have Tammy Sawyer. We're kind of taking a couple steps back. Their comment is referring to the emotional, or is responding to the emotional question. So their comment is that emotional cost starts with the application itself. Imagine the trauma, the fear of checking the box that it causes, and the ripple effect it has on that day or week for the individual. Even the most balanced of us would take some of that home.
Now, every once in a while, as a professor, you get intimidated by your students, right? So not only do I have like these 20 or so distinguished students in front of me, then we had this larger class. Now we got like VIPs calling in from, I think, Shelby County, Tennessee, the head of the Black Caucus, the chair of the Shelby County Board of Commissioners, Madam Commissioner Shelby, just asked, I should say, really posed a serious question in terms of the emotional cost beginning at the point of application. Just forgive your professor. I've talked to people who feel a deep sense of shame, right? Like you got to check a box. It's almost like you got to check, acceptable humanity or unacceptable humanity, right? That's demeaning. That's degrading, right? Particularly at the outset. Like it's not like you even at the point of an interview, right? Okay. So Reverend Green's talked about means and who. Salam, is there anybody else watching the classroom? And then I'll get to Maggie, creative.
Yes, we have two responses, one from Kimberly Short and Alicia. So this is referring to those who have served their time. So Kimberly's comment is after they have served their time, they generally want to be better, yet society treats them as if they have not served their time, do not welcome them into the environment for which they can thrive and be productive citizens of our communities. Alicia's comment is referred to those who have served their time and still have potential. So her comment is, even violent offenders have promise, especially if they are young. Once people have served their time, they deserve a second chance.
This metaphor of having paid your debt to society. Let's think about that metaphor now. I know nobody here has ever like maxed out on the credit card, right? No, that's never happened at Harvard, never happened among any student. But it has happened with other people. In other words, imagine you have maxed out on a credit card. The interest rates keep building. It's not like the debt stays the same. So when it comes to paying your debt to society, when you have a criminal record, the interest rate keeps going. The debt keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So this whole notion, this metaphor of paying your debt to society was, Salam, who made that point? Which student? That wasn't Alicia, that was?
I believe that was Kimberly.
All right, Kimberly, in my class, we have something called like the Nobel Prize for the last 10 minutes in terms of a brilliant comment. That was a brilliant comment. You get the Nobel Prize for like the last 10 minutes, all right? Anybody else before we go, I want to go to this, to the next point, and I believe that's a question I'm gonna ask Dwight to lift up for the class. And we're gonna come back to the Reverend Green's point about Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks. We'll say more about that. I'm gonna ask him to say more about that. But Dwight, that third question.
Sure. Thanks, Professor. And thanks everyone for such a robust discussion. It makes me wish we could just continue the class past graduation next week. So we talk a lot about addressing the challenges of criminal justice reform in terms of, either singularly or from a multifaceted perspective, and using a lot of different areas of society, which ones to target to use to address challenges like Ban the Box. So specifically, we want to lift up the question, what languages of reform or transformation might you use to address this challenge, such as policy, law, economics, morality, arts and culture, or generational, or all of the above? So really looking at that wide spectrum of things we can use.
Okay. Now languages, what does that mean? Like in languages of reform or transformation, if someone can just maybe break that down a little bit. What does that mean? In other words, you lifted up law, policy. What does that mean? Like if I'm new to advocacy, and let's say I've just gone through this experience applying for a job and essentially getting kicked in the teeth, right? So and then you say to me, well, like what language will you use to bring about change? Well, I have some language. Maybe my language is outrage. Maybe my language is indignity. Maybe my language is shame. But you didn't use those words. You talked about morality, law, policy. Anybody in the class want to lift up what that might mean? So Jenna, you haven't had an opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. I think just like one thing that I was interested in considering from like the policy perspective is if trying to figure out how when the policy could potentially assuage, the concerns or pushback from employers about, without the information of whether or not candidates have had like criminal records, this impacts my ability to be able to operate my business in an optimal way or to recruit people that I can trust to be safe candidates. And I think one way to address that concern is to potentially build in policies that actually work to make the current responses to the criminal punishment in the criminal punishment system more actually like rehabilitative. Like I think a lot of people can recognize and see that even though currently there might be the use of like the language of rehabilitation, the actual practices or sentences that are put in place can be more destructive than anything, or they aren't really effectively doing things to build people up and better prepare them for life of reintegration back into the community. So one way to make this policy something that could potentially both assuage employers, but also just make the criminal punishment system more effective as a whole is to build in more response centered on employment training or educational opportunities, or ways that actually would make them better employees once they re-enter the
So Jenna, I hear you be saying that there's something you can do about the box. You could take it off the application, but there's something also to be done about the punishment that leads to people being excluded from jobs in the first place. I'll take the last comment from the chat, Salam, and then we'll wrap up with a few lessons, because this case study is based on a real story from the Reverend Green's second home state.
The last comment from the larger classroom is from Alicia. Their comment is around the language question. Perhaps the language that is needed is to create a new environment where the crime is not so important. Ava DuVernay has helped highlight the reality of the criminal industrial complex and its hungry maw, and how easy it is to get swept up in it. People can create jobs where it really doesn't matter if you have a criminal record. It matters if you show up for work.
Wonderful, wonderful. There's so much in your answer, both in terms of a reframe, in terms of the focus on the job versus the crime, but also the means by which you focus on the job versus the crime and the person. The use of film, right? Ava DuVernay's 13. So again, that's a language in terms of art, film, music, as well as law, policy, and economics. So Kathleen, if we can just turn to the slides, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity by telling a true story, we can pull in the insights from this class in the larger classroom. So let's call it lessons learned. Here we have a group of people protesting, demonstrating for a policy called Ban the Box, literally banning, taking off the employment application, the question posed, have you ever been arrested or convicted of a crime? Next slide. So here we have two women, a teenage girl and a middle-aged woman, obviously Claudette Colvin on the left, Rosa Parks on the right. And so when we think about how do we put a face on a movement, a face on reform, a face on transformation, we often see this notion of perfect and imperfect victims, right? So in other words, young Black men are often portrayed, stereotyped as people to be afraid of. Therefore, they're not deemed to be acceptable as the poster children, if you will, of reform and transformation. And when you practice the politics of respectability, right? Meaning that a young Black man, perhaps dressed in a suit as opposed to athletic wear, which is deemed to be unacceptable and something to be a cause of concern, i.e. Trayvon Martin, and wearing a hoodie. So there's this notion of imperfect, less empathetic, less sympathetic victims. But here you have two women who literally launched the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement before the civil rights movement we're in, right? In that civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, we have Claudette Colvin and we have Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was stereotyped as this quiet, demure, reticent, middle-aged Black woman who was too tired to give up her seat on a bus. And then we have Claudette Colvin, who was understood at the time to be this rebellious teenager who refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. But the story is more complicated in terms of the woman on the left being deemed imperfect and the woman on the right being deemed the perfect patron saint of respectability and rectitude, Rosa Parks. Well, it just so happened that Rosa Parks was described as a child as being feisty. That is to say, having a Claudette Colvin spirit, right? Rebellious in all the right ways. Rosa Parks, who was trained at the Highlander Folk School, trained in the citizenship schools before she refused to give up her seat. So in other words, she was a trained civil rights activist in her 40s when she refused to give up her seat. But you'll remember that in her 30s, when Recy Taylor was sexually assaulted, Rosa Parks went to her side lifted up her cause and created a national movement against sexual assault years before our rape crisis centers. So she was a trained, insubordinate, rebellious woman. The point being here is perfect and imperfect victims are related. And it's the humanity that unites them. So in our movements, we may want to think about literally displaying different facets and faces of humanity so that our movements do not exclude the people who they're ostensibly designed to advocate on behalf of. So we want, that's something for us to consider as an advocacy lesson. Next slide. So in the state of New Jersey, where the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice endeavored to pass a ban the box law, we use, as I was the CEO at that time, we use young Black men, young Latino men. We use older men, younger men, older people of various and younger people of various gender and gender identities and races and ethnicities. So in other words, we had all kinds of people going to the state legislature, calling for reform, calling for the box to be banned. Second lesson here, creating an architecture of listening. How do you get people engaged in terms of passing a law? In the case of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice in Newark, New Jersey, we literally had 60 or 70 organizations all across the state conducting forums and town meetings, asking people how they felt about a law that would ban the box, that would postpone the question until after the interview. So we created an architecture, a structure of listening so we can get people engaged in the process. Why is this important? You cannot engage in social justice and leave the people out, okay? In other words, people don't trust you if they're not involved, not merely on the implementation stage. Class, I need you to hear me, I need you to feel me on this, not merely on the implementation stage, but on the ideation stage, right? In other words, when you're coming up with the law, when you're coming up with the policy, when you're crafting the law, you got to engage the people. You got to talk to the people about their ideas, right? Not just because you're trying to get them to bless what you've already selected and already chosen to do, but because they have their own analytic insights, right? So in other words, this class is distinctive and powerful as a consequence of our collective brilliance, not any individual student. So you got to build an architecture of listening, which means you got to be thoughtful and strategic about how you engage the community. What kinds of technology do you use? What kinds of meetings do you use? Do you create places and spaces that allow for all kinds of voices, all kinds of expressions, all kinds of races and ethnicities, and certainly hear me on this, all different, I should say, all kinds of generations, younger and older people. Next slide. Using data as a policy tool, just being very clear here. In New Jersey, there was a book called Marked, which described this problem of discrimination based on criminal records, written by a scholar by the name of Diva Paget. Now, what we did was we took her scholarship, that study that said a Black man without a criminal record is less likely to get a job than a white man with a criminal record. And we used her scholarship to organize people. Why? Because scholarship can sometimes tell you not just what the harm is and what the hurt is, but who's hurting and who's harmed. And if you know who's hurting and who's harmed, you can organize, right? So in other words, scholarship is not merely a policy tool, it's an organizing instrument. Right? And when the student lifted up the externalities, the emotional cost, the invisible cost of a policy, go after the people who don't know or have not been recognized as having been hurt. They are a powerful source of organization. Next slide. Secular scholarship in sacred text. Really quickly here. Going to Bjorn's point about redemption and forgiveness. There was a scholar by the name of Alfred Blumstein who did a study called the Redemption Study. Note that word. And it basically discovered this. It basically said this: if a person goes a certain period of time without committing a crime, they're no more likely to commit crime than anyone else in the job market. So in other words, after 7 years, if you don't commit another crime, you're like anybody else. It was called the redemption study. In New Jersey, we used that study in sociology, in criminology, and presented it to ministers, imams, priests, and rabbis. And we asked them, what does the redemption study mean in terms of your faith? They said forgiveness. We then asked them to go out and advocate for the law. And literally the Jewish Federation, the Catholic, the Archdiocese, many of the priests, Baptists, imams, evangelicals, all organized together. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Really quickly, you got to make that connection between money and morals. Make the moral argument, but also the money argument. I mean, in other words, as was lifted up brilliantly by this class, the box impacts not just the people with the criminal records, it impacts the people who want to hire people who are talented, who are gifted, who are hardworking, but who have a criminal record. So frame arguments in terms of moral appeals as well as money appeals in terms of passing law and legislation. Next slide. Movement momentum. This is a picture of John Lewis back in the 1960s being beaten to the ground. You understand, you recall Bloody Sunday, a terrible day, a tragic day, a violent day, a seeming defeat to voting rights in this country. The point of this picture is that day was the day in effect that catalyzed the passage of the Voting Rights Act. In other words, sometimes your defeats can be turned into victories if you can create a sense of momentum. So in other words, the most strategic advocates think of losses, setbacks as opportunities for leadership to catalyze and create a sense of momentum that builds a sense of agency, right? So in other words, John Lewis and Amelia Boynton being beaten stirred the conscience of the country. But the advocates were smart enough to go beyond conscience to policy, right? Next slide. And we're going to end on this slide, which is quite simply this. And this is the note of inspiration. This class is about moral ambition, right? So in other words, you can know the law, you can know the policy, you know the economics, you can know the theology, you can know the ethics, you can have an idea about how to change the world, but it requires moral ambition, right? In other words, you have to think broadly, expansively, and be pragmatic, and use all the tools at the table. And one of the best examples of this is Paulie Murray. Paulie Murray, literally, I was a Black woman, only woman in her class at Howard University. She came up with the idea that inspired the men, Thurgood Marshall, Spotswood Robinson, and so many others to win the Brown versus Board of Education decision. She inspired them while she was a law student, like many of you. So she's an example because she was a lawyer, because she got arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus before Rosa Parks. She was a protester, she was a demonstrator, she was active in the union movement. She became not just a lawyer, but she became also a professor. She became a poet. She became the first Black woman Episcopal priest and a saint in the Episcopal Church. Why did we lift her up as an example? Because she used so many of the tools of advocacy, right? And she used all the languages of advocacy: poetry, music, writing, language, I said law, policy, and certainly morality. And so in this class, we want to just send you away with this notion that this is a tragic moment in our history. It's a difficult moment in our history. The Reverend Green has worked in Newark, New Jersey, works in New York City, and my class members work all across the country and around the world. They understand profoundly, as I hope you do, that this is a moment for decisive leadership, right? So in other words, you can't shrink from the moment. You got to step into the moment. But to do so, we got to be strategic. We have to study. We have to engage in the craft of advocacy, right? So in other words, it's not merely a matter of conscience, it's a matter of craft, not merely a matter of street presence, but also studied activity. When we combine the heart, the mind, the strategy, the tactics, as well as philosophy and all the languages of advocacy, and ensure that we're multilingual, multi-level, different levels, multi-languages, but multi-generational. When we do that, we have a hope of realizing the hopes of our forebears. So with that said, thank you so much. And If you see any of these leaders on the screen and any of the leaders in the large classroom, give them your full support. Thank you. Back to you, Devin. Okay, I think we're off camera. Elizabeth, I didn't get to you. This was race class. This is like as in racing. Just to get through all of that in this compressed time frame. So thank you to all of you, certainly to Kathleen, to Anon and Dwight and Reverend Green. Now, Reverend Green actually preaches, leads, teaches as well or better than I do. So he really played my side man. So y'all just got a tidbit. He does this for real. And I've
always willing to be your sidekick. Thank you so much for allowing me to participate. Well,
listen, though, thank you. And you all will see him in class again at Harvard. So I want to really, again, just thank all of you. I'm going to head back into the larger classroom to get ready for this engagement with W. Kamal Bell.
Take care.
So thank you.